Welcome to my kitchen where we don't cook, but we make fiber art. And today we're going to be making this sunglass scrap yarn case using the Ravel cord waste yarn cast on method. So we're going to start by casting on with extra yarn or waste yarn. To do this, it's just one more step from the waste yarn method. So if you'd like a full in-depth tutorial on how to cast on or what the waste yarn method is, check out the description in the video below, and I have links to both of those tutorials there for you. So we're going to cast on with our waste yarn. This is a light-weighted yarn, but is not a part of the project yarn, and you want it to be in a contrasting color to your project yarn. And I like to do between 5 and 6 rows for the cast on. Once your rows of your waste yarn or your scrap yarn is done, then we're going to take another color. This is the Ravel cord, and I'm going to use purple. And we're going to add it to the machine just like you would when you're adding a new color or a second skein of yarn. So I've put my waste yarn in the middle of my machine, and then at my white needle, that's where I like to start my next rows. I hook it around the white needle and put it into my yarn holder and yarn tensioner. You don't want to skip a needle, because if you did, then you would get a drop stitch where you skip the needle. So make sure it's the next needle where you add on your Ravel cord. And now we're going to crank around one time. So we just do one row with our Ravel cord, which is nice to do a different color from your waste yarn to your project yarn. So it's easy to identify which one's your Ravel cord. Now I stop that at my 47th needle because I just do one row. And now we're going to add on our project yarn. And again, since I stopped at my 47th needle, I just want to make sure all the yarn is down and hooked in there. And now I add on my project yarn to my white needle, my 48th needle, and then you're going to crank out your rows like normal. Again, make sure you don't skip a needle. If you stop at your 47th needle, your next needle, which is my white one, the 48th, is where you want to add on your project yarn. You want to make it like a continuous piece of yarn. You don't want to skip any needles. And now you will crank out as many rows as you need for your project. So I'm going to speed up the video while I crank out my project yarn rows. While I'm cranking these rows out, I just wanted to take a minute to talk a little bit about the Ravel cord. This is a knitting method knitters use, and it's recommended for your Ravel cord is you want to use a strong fiber yarn. In this video, I used an acrylic yarn, and I'm going to show you what can happen and how to fix it when you use the acrylic yarn, because it can break. It's recommended to use a silk or a cotton yarn as your Ravel cord, as that fiber is stronger. But if you only have acrylic like I do, acrylic will work just fine. But it is also recommended that it's in a similar weight to your project yarn. And we will talk about 2 different options with this when we go to remove the waste yarn, so you can see the difference when using acrylic yarn. Okay, all of my project yarn has now been cranked out. I've done as many rows as I want. So now we're going to put the rest of my project yarn into the middle of my machine, any of the leftovers. And again, I stopped at my 47th needle. That's what my project yarn is hooked onto. Now we're going to do another Ravel cord, and I start it at my white needle, the next needle over from where my project yarn stopped. And again, I'm going to use the purple yarn, and then we're going to crank one row around with the purple yarn as our Ravel cord. Once we have one row, we're going to take the tail end of our Ravel cord, any extra, and we are going to put it in the machine. And I stopped at my 47th needle. That's what the Ravel cord is still hooked onto. And the tail is in the middle of the machine. Now let's do our cast off with our waste yarn. I'm going to get the yellow yarn again, and I'm going to add it to my 48th white needle. Put the tail end down into the machine, and now we're going to crank out, I like between 8 and 10 rows. As the waste yarn cast off, we are not going to lock any of the stitches, so they can drop a few. So that's why I like to add a few more rows of my cast off waste yarn, just in case any stitches drop, they won't drop all the way down to my project yarn. Once you have your rows of your waste yarn done, you can either cut the end of your tail yarn, or you can just let it run out. And then once the tail runs out through the machine, there's no more yarn being cranked on there. Crank one time around, and then when you crank the second time around, your project will come off the machine. So now that the project's off, we want to make sure we have it the knit side out, which is the V stitches. This is the knit side, and you can give it a little stretch to pull it out. And now we want to take the tail ends of our yarn and remove them from the inside of the tube. So to close the tube flat, I like to hold it like this with the tail ends at the bottom. Now we're going to take a crochet hook and we are going to count our stitches. Starting at the bottom, we're going to count each of these stitches up the side of the project. Now we want to count the gray stitches that are sandwiched in between our ravel cord and the waste yarn. We're counting the gray stitches and we should count 24 from the bottom of where the tail yarn is to the top because we have 48 stitches in total. Now we're going to go to the other side where the tail end of our waste yarn is, and we're going to count the gray stitches up again all the way to the top till we get to 24. And we should mark that, and there should be 224 stitches marked with a stitch marker. If you have stitch marker with then a stitch in between and another stitch marker, you miscounted, so you'll want to recount. Or if you land on the same stitch that's already marked, you've also miscounted. You should have 2 stitches marked as your 24th stitches. I'm going to remove the stitch markers, but I kind of pulled on the stitches so they're up a little bit looser so I know where they're still at. And I take my crochet hook and I pick up the right stitch and with my crochet hook, and then I'm going to pick up the left stitch. Both of these were the 24th stitch. And now I slip stitch the left through the right loop. Now we're going to pick up the right loop. I still have 1 loop on my hook. I pick up the next gray stitch and I pick up the right one and I slip stitch the one I just picked up because that's the closest to the hook, slip stitch it through the second one. Now I go to the left and I pick up a loop and I slip stitch this loop now through the loop on my hook. 1 loop left on the hook, pick up a right stitch, slip stitch the first loop through the second loop, and this is what we're going to do back and forth all the way down, creating this X or zigzag shape. And the stitches I'm only picking up are the gray stitches or the project stitches. The purple yarn stitches, that's my ravel cord, and the yellow yarn stitches, that's my waste yarn. And so that's why it's really important to have different colors for your yarn so you can see which stitches are your project yarn versus the ravel cord or the waste yarn so you don't pick up the wrong stitches when you're closing it shut. I am only picking up the gray stitches on this side. Now I'm going to speed this up. We're going to slip stitch every stitch all the way down. You should be picking up 48 of them so you can count it as well, until we're down to the end. And once you have the last loop left on your hook, I'm going to slow down the end here. I'm just slip stitching my last few stitches together, and you might want to just move and pull on that waste yarn, move the tail ends out of the way to make sure you're picking up every single stitch because they can kind of get hidden down here at the bottom. So you might just need to pull the yarn or move the tail ends of the waste yarn or the ravel cord out of the way so you can find them. Because if you miss picking up a stitch and you remove the ravel cord and the waste yarn, that stitch will then still be live and not secured, and then that row will completely unravel on you. So that's why it's important you pick up all of your project stitches. Now we have our last stitch on the crochet hook, and I'm going to take the tail end of the project yarn and I'm going to slip stitch this tail through this last loop so all 48 stitches are now secured. And now, once that's done, you have secured your tube flat on one side. Now at this point, I take my project and I'm just going to pull on it to view all of the stitches to make sure I've secured every single one. So I pull on the waste yarn like this. If I find any big or large holes in the zigzag pattern, that means that I missed a stitch and I want to undo my slip stitches so I can make sure I go back and pick up the one I missed and redo it. Because again, if you remove the waste yarn, that stitch would drop and your row would unravel. Before you close the other side of your tube, if you use multiple colors, make sure you knot down the tail ends of the 2 colors you put together. I just secure it with a few knots, and if the tail ends are really long at this point, I could cut them down a little bit shorter, or you can just leave them long and inside the tube of your project. I'm going to speed up this part of the video, but the other side of your tube, you're going to do the same exact thing. You're going to count your 224 stitches on either side, mark them with a stitch marker, and then you're going to slip stitch them down in that zigzag pattern all the way down to the bottom. So on this side, all my live stitches or the project stitches are the peach color that I am picking up. Now that we're down to the end, I'm going to secure my last live stitch on my crochet hook with the tail end of the peach project yarn. Once your stitches are all secured and you have your tube closed, we can remove the waste yarn using our Ravel cord. I'm going to show you this project first. This was a Ravel cord that I used, and it is an acrylic yarn, but I used a number 3 weighted yarn or a DK yarn as my Ravel cord, and then all my other yarn was a number 4 or a worsted yarn. And so when I pull that Ravel cord out, this yarn did not break, and I think because it was slightly smaller than my project yarn, and so it came out easier even though it was an acrylic yarn. For this one that I did, I used the same weight yarn. All the yarn on this project is a number 4 or a worsted weight yarn. The other thing is that this was the number 4 worsted big twist value brand yarn, and as you pull it, you might cinch up your project a little bit, and that's fine because we're trying to remove that Ravel cord. But you see when it got kind of tight, my Ravel cord broke. So then I went to the other side of the Ravel cord, pulled on it, and it broke as well. If that happens to you, that's fine. All you need to do is unscrunch your project and find where the Ravel cord has been removed, where it broke, and those stitches will fall off. And this is why it's really good to use a different color for your Ravel cord compared to your waste yarn and your project yarn. So it's really easy to identify what's my Ravel cord. I found my little tail end that's still in there that broke, and then we're just going to remove the rest of the Ravel cord. So I took a stitch marker, and since it got cinched up pretty tight, I just kind of pick out one of the stitches that's purple because I know it's my Ravel cord, and then I was able to remove the rest of it, and then your project yarn and your waste yarn comes apart and you're left with a really nice finished project. So now we're going to go to the other side of our tube, and we're going to do the same thing. We want to remove the Ravel cord. So when we pull on the tail, first the stitches are going to disappear. Just doing that by itself, all the stitches are hooked together. You need to completely remove your Ravel cord. And the same thing happened on this side. As I continue pulling and it kind of scrunches up the project, the Ravel cord broke, and I think it's because it's an acrylic yarn. But then I pulled the other tail in and I was able to remove it all, and now we're left with a really nice finished completed project. So now let's make our sunglass case. Here's my sunglasses, and I want to fold my project like a burrito or lengthwise, and we're going to mattress stitch up the length of our project. So we want to fold it in half, and then we want to take the tail end of one side of our project yarn, and using a darning needle or a large eye plastic needle, we're going to mattress stitch up the side. So first, to connect the two corners, I'm going to zoom in here so you can see this a little bit easier. I'm going to insert my needle into the opposite side so we can join the two corners together. Now we start the mattress stitch. So you can see where there's this V stitch, that's our knit stitch, and in between the V, there's that horizontal bar of thread. That's what we pick up with our needle. We start at one side, then we go over to the other side. And do the same thing where that V stitch is, go into the middle of the V and pick up that horizontal bar with your needle and thread. And you're going to do this back and forth, side to side, all the way up your project. And you're going to make sure when you're going side to side, you're staying in the same row of the knit stitch. If you jump over a row, it will start to twist the mattress stitch and the pattern won't look even and won't disappear or be as seamless looking. So I zoomed out so you can see there's kind of these loops here that you can see once you start mattress stitching, and that's how I make sure that I'm staying on the same row of my V stitches on every other one. If it doesn't look consistent, I know I've skipped over to a different row as well. Periodically, I check my work and I will pull on the tail on the working yarn, closing the mattress stitch, and it should look like a seamless stitch where you really cannot see where you have mattress stitched the two sides together like this. And so you're going to continue this mattress stitch going back and forth, side to side, all the way up your project. And then I'm going to show this here just because it might be a little bit easier to see where I'm picking up the stitches, seeing the two colored yarns. So I'll leave this in real time so you can watch it and so you can just see how the mattress stitch goes. So again, just take your time, and if you do find that you started going over on the wrong row or something, you can always undo these mattress stitches really easy just by pulling out the working yarn and picking up the correct stitches. So it's not hard to fix a mistake if you accidentally jump over to a wrong row. I've done that quite a few times. And again, every now and then pull on that tail end to tighten your mattress stitch to check your work. And I'll start to speed up the video to finish this till we get to the top. And then it should look pretty seamless as you get to the top and you pull the tail end of your working yarn. And even if you use a different color for the mattress stitch, it will really hide in there quite well unless you really stretch the fabric apart. So it's okay to even use a different fabric if you want to. It's only if you really stretch it apart would you see that mattress stitch of a different color fabric like that. So now to secure the tail end of my project yarn, I'm just going to do a knot with both ends of my project yarn. And now we're going to sew close the bottom of our tube for our case. So here it is where we slip stitched it closed, and I have the tail end of the working yarn of my peach yarn, and I'm going to put that on the darning needle as well. And then I'm just going to sew back and forth between those slip stitches to close the tube shut. And I'm going back and forth between each stitch and each row, going through both layers of the tube to close it down tightly, and so there's no gaps. So I'll speed this part up, just going back and forth, closing down the tube on the end. So we have a bottom, and then once I get to the end of where the tube is now closed shut, it should look something like this. And then I'm just going to knot the end of my tail yarn, and I'm going to hide the tails of the ends of my project yarn. I'm going to kind of weave them in, and then I'm going to hide them in between the two layers of the fabric. I'll just give them a few little knots and then we'll hide them in between. So now at this point our project is complete and our sunglasses do fit inside for our sunglass case to keep them from getting scratched if they're inside your purse from your keys or anything else. The option is you can get one of these closers that's a little magnetic purse closer that I got off of Amazon, and you can sew that down the top so your sunglasses don't fall out. And I just got a needle and some thread I had lying around and sewed on both sides so you can see how they work. There's two sides of it that makes a little magnetic clasp. So I hope you enjoyed this scrap yarn idea project. Like and follow for more, and happy crafting, everybody.